Let me introduce you to our fantastic speaker for today. Let's start a little bit with what is the Investigator of the Year award. So every year, the Heart Institute awards somebody really awesome, the Heart Institute's Investigator of the Year award. That recognizes researchers who made outstanding achievements in the past calendar year. And I'm delighted to announce, if you don't already know, that this year's Investigator of the Year award is my incredible colleague, Dr. Heather Tulloch. Heather Tulloch needs no introduction. She's well known and well loved by all of us. But just to make justice to her wonderful CV, she is a clinical health and rehabilitation psychologist, scientist, and director of the Cardiovascular Health Psychology and Behavioral Medicine Laboratory here at the Heart Institute. Her innovative research program focuses on the development of psychological interventions to improve mental health and outcomes for cardiovascular patients. She has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles, which together have accumulated nearly 5,000 citations. And impressively, earning her this recognition of Investigator of the Year, nearly 20% of her lifetime publications have occurred in 2022 alone, really demonstrating exponential productivity by Dr. Tulloch and her team. Some prominent examples from her research program include a screening and triage protocol for depression and anxiety in cardiac rehabilitation, as well as the identification of what means to have a clinically significant change on mental health screeners. Dr. Tulloch is an outstanding grant writer and recipient. She has received amazing external peer review funding, totaling over $10 million, and about $3 million of those are actually directly to her as a principal investigator. In 2022 alone, she received grant support from CRHR, Heart and Stroke, as well as the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Her innovative research program and dedication to mentorship have attracted the best and the brightest trainees to her program year after year. Her trainees have gone on to receive prestigious Tri-Council and other awards. And since we're talking about this year's achievement, this past year alone, Dr. Tulloch mentored her postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Karen Bouchard, through the SSHRC Insight Development Grant Competition, paving the way for Dr. Bouchard to secure her first grant as a nominated principal investigator and actually the Heart Institute's first ever SSHRC grant. So congratulations to both of you. And in addition to her phenomenal job as a scientist, Dr. Tulloch is also highly sought after for speaking engagement. And recent talks this year have included the European Health Psychology Society Conference in Slovakia, as well as an invited presentation at Columbia University, an Ivy League university in New York City in the United States. And as a testament to her success and potential, this past year, Dr. Tulloch has received a number of prominent external recognitions, including the Terry Kavanagh Award from the Canadian Association of Cardiovascular Rehabilitation and Prevention, which is the most prestigious award for demonstrated leadership and significant contributions to the field of cardiovascular prevention, rehab, and chronic disease management. So this is all what's in her CV, and I could go on and on, but what's not written on her CV, but I should also share here, is Dr. Tulloch is truly what I like to call a queen of awesomeness. On top of all of her amazing academic attributes that I just shared, she's also one of the most fun people to work with, a phenomenal team player, and just great at everything she tries her hand on. And I don't know if research services keeps tracks of this kind of data, but I'm pretty sure that no one in the Heart Institute holds such a high percentage of grant success. Everything Heather writes is gold, and she gets it almost every time on the first try. I'm very envious of this, and I'm really hoping that she's going to share those secrets with us today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Tulloch to her UHI Investigator of the Year Award talk. Welcome, Dr. Tulloch.
You're making me blush. Thank you. That was very kind. And, knowing that there's so many amazing researchers here at the Heart Institute, it's quite an honor to have this award this year. So thank you. So I was told to talk a little bit about sort of how I got here. And so it's been kind of a long road and it has not been direct. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. It actually looks a little bit more like this. It's a bit of a roller coaster in multiple directions. And so Dr. Burney once said to me, you know, you should pick only 2 areas, only 2 of research and focus on that. Well, David, I have failed miserably, and you're going to see a little bit of that over time here. So I'm going to talk about some of the paths that I've taken. And down this road, I think what I'm going to do is take us on a quick drive, probably surpass the speed limit, in fact, especially at the beginning. And then I'm going to slow down a little bit more with some of the current projects. But I just want to highlight some of the work and how important psychological factors are in heart disease. So I started out here actually doing my dissertation, working with Bob Reed and Andrew Pipe. And we started looking initially at exercise determinants and motivation. And I looked at severity of the illness, things like self-efficacy and outcome expectations. And of course, these things predicted exercise intentions and behavior. And I continued on looking at more longitudinal studies to see what helped people remain active. So if they had cardiac disease and they started exercising after a heart event, what kept them going? And so in this one study where we looked over 2 years post their event, we found that those, surprise, surprise, that had more confidence in exercise and their ability to do that, as well as those that had expectations of positive outcomes for their health, they were more likely to keep exercising, but also if they had self-determined motivation. So this is obviously a psychology concept that talks about really that intrinsic motivation, doing things more for the enjoyment because you want to do it, not because your doctor's telling you to do it. I also looked a little bit about exercise adoption and maintenance in diabetes patients, and we found that those that maintained activity levels had the same number of perceived barriers to exercise. So we all have those barriers to get off our butts and get out there exercising. But those that actually did the exercise had more facilitators. So they were, had family support, or, they really thought about the health benefits that they were going to receive. The other piece that was interesting in this study is they incorporated resistance exercise, and incorporating that actually improved individuals' sense of well-being and enjoyment. And if you recall, I was saying enjoyment certainly is a factor that keeps people going. Andrew Pipe always says it has to be fun. So these studies fed into the development of some of the interventions in cardiac rehab, as well as other online interventions for cardiac patients. So then I sort of moved along past determinants of exercise and teamed up with my esteemed colleague who's in front of me here in the room, Jennifer Reed. And we investigated sort of more on the other end of the spectrum, at least for me. And we looked at, the outcomes of mental health and quality of life that were coming out of different exercise modalities. And so you will not be surprised, of course, that individuals that were exercising, and this is across, whether it be women, whether it be coronary artery disease, whether it be atrial fibrillation, they did see improvements in their mental health and quality of life. So, and I want to say thank you to Jennifer for keeping me in as we go in the years here of exercise, because I do enjoy doing it, but I just can't lead it. So I thank you. She's the exercise physiologist. This is the way it should be. So then I sort of moved, still talking about health behaviors, but moved into smoking cessation. And as you can see here on the slide, at that time, which is about 10 years ago, smoking prevalence rates had dropped to about 16%, but those that were still smoking were those with psychiatric illness. And in fact, individuals with schizophrenia actually were about 80% of them were smoking. So the problem, though, is that most studies would exclude these patients. They would not allow them to participate in any of these medication trials that were helping smokers quit. And most of that was because they were concerned about the neuropsychiatric symptoms that the medications might bring about. So I'm proud to say that I teamed up with my fearless leader at the time, Dr. Andrew Pipe, and got my first heart and stroke grant. It was $800,000. Can you believe Heart and Stroke gave that at that time? We're now capped at $300,000, but I was very excited. I was jumping up and down, I'm not gonna lie. And so we did this randomized controlled trial where we randomized individuals or smokers to one of three conditions. One was the patch, so just the nicotine replacement patch. The second was the patch plus the gum and inhaler, and we allowed them to use it for a longer period of time. And then the third one was varenicline. And so I'm proud to say that this is one of the largest studies with patients with psychiatric illness and smoking cessation. We were able to recruit over 300 patients, and almost 60% of them had a history of psychiatric illness. So that is telling you what was out, of those that were still smoking. We did find that combination NRT and varenicline did enhance quitting in the first 10 weeks, but that varenicline was the one that really helped with abstinence rates at sort of the 6-month and 1-year point. Now, there was some difference depending on which measure we used for smoking cessation. So it wasn't 100% clear that varenicline is 100% the way to go, but certainly we could see improvements in the quit rates. And interestingly, there were not statistically significant differences between those that had psychiatric illness and not. Now, they did have a little bit lower quit rates for sure, but it wasn't statistically significant. We also didn't see differences in adverse events. And that was the big thing where people were advised not to use any of these medications because, something's going to happen. But in fact, we didn't see that. So we then said, okay, great. We can actually advocate that all smokers, no matter whether they have a psychiatric illness or not, can use these medications and help them quit smoking. So then, as Tice has already mentioned, I decided, I need to be a little bit smarter here. I need to combine my clinical work more with my research. And so I started to focus a little bit on cardiac rehab. And as I'm sure you all know, resources are fairly tight. And so, being able to provide psychology services to all can be difficult. And so what we did was created this screening for depression and anxiety, a triage protocol. And we took all the patients coming into cardiac rehab and they completed the HADS, the Hospital Anxiety Depression Scale. And we said anyone that had really elevated scores, which were about 19%, they would be seen by psychology. But those that had sort of this mild or moderate level, we said, you know what, let's wait 4 weeks. Let's see how they're doing in cardiac rehab, see if those scores come down, see if it's sort of just after the event, things sort of settle for them. And in fact, that was the case. There were a number of individuals that didn't need to be seen, so about 30%. So what that allowed us to do was save quite a bit of time, and also not only our time, but also the patients, because by the time they had this appointment with us, and at that point, everyone was coming into the hospital. So it was parking, it was all of those pieces for them to say, or for us to say, hey, you're doing pretty well. So we were happy to put this program into place so that we could better triage to our limited resources. The next thing that we did was, we were using the HADS as a measure, looking at cardiac rehab, see what the changes were over time, but also in our psychological interventions. We had groups that we were running and we were seeing what are their HADS scores before and after. And so, but there was no minimally clinically important difference that was already established. So Jennifer said, hey, you know what? We got to do this. I have this student. So Kyla May, who's in the picture here, who was working with Jennifer at the time, did a wonderful study and did a lot of work so that we could establish the MCID. So now in our studies, we're able to see, is there a clinically significant change in these interventions? So then I kept on moving along. I must have ADHD because I seem to like to do a lot of things. Anyways, I often would hear from patients in my clinical world about their sleep problems. And of course, that was affecting their mood. And so along with Dr. Adam Heaton, who you can see there on the screen, who was a postdoctoral fellow working with me, who had some specialized training in insomnia, we decided, let's create a program for them, a treatment program. So we created what we called the Sleep to Your Heart's Content Insomnia Treatment Program. And so we did a proof of concept study where we took the 6-week intervention, we gave it to a number of cardiac rehab participants, and we measured sleep quality, duration, and efficiency over that 6-week period. And we found that, of course, it did improve over time quite significantly, and it also reduced anxiety and depression. So then we said, okay, That seems to work just pre-post, but what about doing an actual randomized controlled trial? So that was the next thing that we did, where we had patients that were in cardiac rehab. We either randomized them to cardiac rehab alone or cardiac rehab plus this cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia treatment program. And what we found was after the 6-week treatment, for those that were, or for all participants, those that were in the CBTI group were actually had subclinical symptoms of insomnia. So when they came into the study, they actually met the DSM criteria for insomnia. And after that 6 weeks, they no longer did. Whereas those that were in the cardiac rehab alone group continued to have clinical symptoms of insomnia. We also noticed differences between the groups on depression, anxiety, and quality of life. So those that were in the treatment group had improvements. So that's the sleep work that we've done. Then again, another patient in my office who was post-cardiac arrest, who had depression and anxiety. And talking, I just remember this first patient that I had, and I just thought, geez, this is not about depression, or the reason he's got depression is because he's got these cognitive changes. And I am not a neuropsychologist, so this is not my expertise per se, but I would call my friend and colleague over at the Civic, who is a neuropsychologist, and Barb Collins is her name. I'd say, Barb, something's not right. Like, I think this anxiety is coming from these cognitive issues. They're going back to their job. He's not able to do his work because he just can't multitask the way he used to. So we looked in the literature, to see, to help me sort of lead me in my clinical care. And there was really very little. So put in a grant, of course, because that's what we do. And was lucky to receive Heart and Stroke and CHR funding to look at cognitive dysfunction in those who had a cardiac arrest. So what we did was a longitudinal observational study where we had patients that were considered to have good clinical outcomes. So if they'd had a cardiac arrest and they were not functioning well, we did not include them. But if they were considered, you're doing well, you're going back, you can go back to work, et cetera, then we included those individuals. And we compared them to those that had an MI. They came in, or they were in hospital. So we did assessments in hospital at baseline or shortly thereafter. And then we had these assessments done again 12 months later, so 1 year post their arrest. And what we found was that the rates of impairment were actually 6 times higher for OHCA patients as compared to MI patients. So quite a bit higher. And Aziza, who was in that last slide in the picture, she was a research coordinator and a PhD student in neuropsychology. And she did wonderful work doing many of these assessments and was able to, put this data together for a dissertation. And we saw that at each sort of different cognitive domain, the patients with cardiac arrest really did have worse outcomes than those that had an MI. The other thing that we looked at was the link between some clinical variables and impairment. And we saw that downtime, surprise, surprise, was a significant predictor of cognitive impairment. But then Aziza, astutely looked at downtime, or the interaction between downtime and intervention, so immediate interventions. And what we found was if the individual was given CPR or defibrillator within 1 minute of going down, their outcomes were much better. So that's really, to say, hey, let's keep those AEDs in those hockey arenas, et cetera, right? We're doing well. We are currently analyzing, well, actually, we've already analyzed the 12-month data. We're currently writing up the paper, and little spoiler alert, they're actually doing much better. There's still some that have impairment, but it's amazing how the brain works and recovers over that year period. But the best thing that came from this study is Adam and Aziza, the postdoc and the research coordinator, got married. So speaking of couples, I'm going to go now into my Healing Hearts Together study. So this is where I'll slow down a little bit because this is something that's currently ongoing. And I think many of you have heard me talk about social isolation, and we know that social isolation is not good for our health in general. And certainly it's not good for heart disease. There is evidence that shows that poor social relationships do put you at higher risk of developing coronary artery disease. And also lack of social contact has been shown to be associated with increased risk of incident heart failure. And that social isolation there's not just a cost to the individual, it's also to the system. And we can see that from some of the literature that poor social relationships do impact healthcare utilization. And so, increases in GP visits, ER visits, hospitalization, length of stay, readmissions, et cetera. But the reverse is also true. So positive relationships and survival is linked. So there was this huge meta-analysis. It's sort of one of our pivotal papers, not mine, sorry, out in the literature, but pivotal in our world, that showed that there was a 50% greater likelihood of survival for participants in strong relationships. And this was consistent across age, sex, and initial health status. The other thing that, and probably my most favorite part of this, is that they showed that the magnitude of the association between these biomedical, or between survival with biomedical or behavioral risk factors is about the same. So what that's saying is, we tell people, are you on your cholesterol medication? Have you started exercising? Have you quit smoking? But we don't say, how's your relationship? But the magnitude is the same. So we really need to. There is some research just on simple marital status that shows that just being married actually reduces your risk, cardiovascular risk. There was one study that I like to highlight that had over 2,000, goodness, read the number, 2,000 MI patients. And when they compared them to married patients, they saw that the odds of dying were almost double for those that were never married or divorced, and still elevated for those that were widowed. But I'd like to say it's not merely the presence of the relationship, but it's the quality that's important. So what am I talking about for relationship quality? It's really feelings of satisfaction, having a positive attitude toward your partner, feeling loved, accepted, and emotionally supported. And of course, we all fight with our partners. My husband will tell you that we do, but certainly having infrequent hostile behavior, or that conflict. We all fight a bit, but we don't want it to be there a lot. So I'm not going to go through a ton of the literature here, but I do want to highlight that it has been shown that emotional support from husbands does help protect against things like metabolic syndrome. And probably one of my favorite studies came out about 10 years ago showing that patients in satisfying relationships who were followed for 15 years after having bypass, those that were in satisfying relationships were 3 times more likely to be alive than those that were in unsatisfying relationships. But where's this distress coming from? Well, part of it could be long-standing relationship problems, or it can also be coming from, new things after having the cardiac event. So certainly there's changes in roles and responsibilities. Patients will talk to me about how, they were the ones that were always doing meals and now their partner is having to do that, or maybe the outdoor tasks, the lawn mowing or the shoveling or whatever it is, and now they're having to do that. And so there's some burden related to that, and some guilt of not being able to do some of those things. And there's also different coping styles. So some people are what I like to call approach of copers. So they want to get all the information. They come right at whatever the stressor is. And other people are sort of the avoiders, who are the ostrich with their head in the sand. Just tell me where I need to be and I'll be there. I don't want to know anything else about it. And if they don't cope the same way, that can really cause, rifts in the relationship. And just to highlight that certainly this relationship distress has been shown to be linked to, or it has been linked to cardiovascular disease. And when they studied over a 10-year period, that certainly even when controlling for risk factors like age, blood pressure, BMI, et cetera, that the link to mortality is there. Now, I'm not going to go on for too long about why this might be the case or what are the mechanisms, but as you can see from the slide that I stole out of one of the key papers explaining some of these mechanisms, they do show how the social connection can impact lifestyle. So when you think about it, if you and your partner go for walks together, versus if you have one that says, don't go for the walk today, watch a movie with me, it can impact. Medication adherence is another one. So if your partner says to you, oh, did you remember to take your medications, right? You can see how these things are all affecting. It can also affect you psychologically. So if you're feeling stressed or depressed, and all of these things can impact biomarkers. things like inflammation, which then of course leads to morbidity and mortality. So all that to say, the stress of relationship discord can be detrimental to cardiac health, but supportive relationships may be protective of your heart health. So that's led sort of experts in relationship science and cardiac psychology to call for more couples-based interventions to address some of those mechanisms that I just spoke about. The issue, however, is that there's only one intervention that's been published to date with patients with heart disease and their partners. And what they did in this intervention is it was a physical activity intervention when they added a component of couples' communication skills. And what they found, which is wonderful, is they increased physical activity levels. However, for distressed couples, they did not keep up those levels. So if you were in a happy relationship, you kept walking, right? You kept going together. But if you were not in a happy relationship, then your activity levels dropped back off. So what we decided or thought from this is that, maybe we need more targeted interventions to the relationship quality. So we didn't want to just fully jump right in. And, as the co-chair of the Patient Partnership Council, I definitely always believe, and it would be bad if I didn't, of course, in including patients and their partners in some of the research we're doing. So in this first step, what we did was we just asked patients and partners to come together and tell us a little bit about their experiences with heart disease and how it was impacting their relationship. So we did some focus groups, we recorded those, we just transcribed them, and then did content analysis. These are just some of the questions that we asked, something like, sometimes people say their heart disease brings them closer together. Other times they say that it just seems to create more problems or stress on top of what they already had. How's this experience been for you? And then of course, we want to know would they even be interested in this? And I have to say, although I completely believe in social relationships and couple relationships, I really wondered what people would think, especially, the type A cardiac patient. And I'm type A as well. So I kind of thought, oh, geez, how's this fluffy stuff going to go over? And in fact, they liked it. So we did ask them that question, whether they'd even be interested. And we published the results in BMJ Open. And this is what they told us about some of their challenges. They said, first of all, they do notice this more emotional disconnection. They said the stress of the cardiac event and managing cardiovascular disease led to more conflict and disconnection in their relationship. And I'm sure everyone hears about overprotection as well. And that's something that we often hear about is, patients will say, she's not letting me do anything. She thinks that I can't even lift this light box anymore. And I've heard other patients or the partners saying, well, when I see him eat that piece of pizza, I see death. And so you can see how the partners tend to be overprotective to really care for their loved one, but that causes conflict. There's role changes, as I already alluded to. There's also adjustments and lifestyle changes. So they talked about how, one may be trying to eat really healthy, but the other one is saying, no, I still really like my chicken wings. And so that was creating some conflict. But they also talked about some positive changes, sort of new ways to show affection towards one another. And that came out through their experience of having had a cardiac event. So just one example, I get heart palpitations and I lose it. I don't want to be left alone because I'm scared something might happen. And then the partner says, well, that's a lot on me. It's more than a full-time job. I managed for the first 3 months and then realized I wasn't even breathing. So I got short-tempered, intense, and stressed. And then just speaking of the intervention needs and what they wanted, they told us, first of all, they want practical information. And I think here at the Heart Institute, we're doing that pretty well. We do have a number of workshops, whether it be about healthy eating or stress management that they can participate in. I think sometimes we have to, communicate that to them. Not everyone knows about it. The second thing that they talked about was sharing with peers. They wanted the opportunity to share both with other patients, but also with other partners. So they sort of normalized their feelings. And I can remember the initial groups, many of the partners said, oh gosh, thank God it's not only us. Like I thought we were the only ones struggling. So that was sort of feeling like they weren't alone. And then finally, they did talk about wanting more relationship enhancement. And so assisting to really work with the stressor that is heart disease to rebuild their connections. Excuse me. So just one example of what they said was, we have to slow down our conversations. I say something and he only listened to the first half, but the second half is the most important. Then he gets mad at me because I didn't do what he thought I said. We used to say everything in shorthand, and now we have to go back to longhand. I think communication is a key, and sometimes you need that third party to get that communication going. So what this qualitative study showed was that, clearly there's an impact on the relationship from heart disease, and there was an interest in couples intervention. Excuse me. So we decided that we should put together an intervention. So I teamed up with some of my colleagues. So Dr. Sue Johnson, who is an internationally renowned couples therapist, Paul Greenman, who I went to grad school with, who is also a couples therapist who is actually just in Germany teaching about some of the therapies that we do, and Natasha Demidenko, who's also a couples therapist, but also works as a psychologist at the Ottawa Hospital. So we put all our brains together and we developed the Healing Hearts Together program, which is an evidence-based intervention based on emotionally focused therapy. Now, I have to say, this is not a therapeutic, like a couples therapy intervention, although I think sometimes people feel that way. But certainly it's more about relationship enhancement so that they can then come together and work towards their heart disease, or the heart disease of the partner, the patient, excuse me. So what we decided to do was create 8 sessions where patients came in and their partners, and they would talk about, we would talk about a topic that may be concerning to them. And then we had them go into sort of break off from the group, and in their dyads talk to each other about a certain topic that we've introduced. And then we'd have them come back and have some group discussion and sharing. And then they also did some at-home exercises. So we decided that we should be testing this to see if it's actually working. So we initially did a proof of concept trial where we wanted to assess the feasibility, the participant satisfaction, as well as to see if the intervention had an impact on relationship quality, mental health, and quality of life. And what we found, or what we asked people to do, was complete questionnaires, before and after the Healing Hearts Together 8-week intervention. And then patients also provided sort of qualitative data. We just asked them, what did you like? What did you not like? What would you change? So that we could tweak the intervention. And as we published in this paper in Health Psychology, we found that the participants were fairly similar to what we see in cardiac rehab. They were a little bit younger, I'd say, but yet they were still in relationships for a long period of time, 26 years on average. And most of them had coronary artery disease. And then the second sort of highest was those with heart failure that participated. And what we saw was that there were improvements in relationship quality, and even a little bit more for the partners than the patients. We also saw improvements in depression, as well as anxiety. And again, a little bit more for the partners than the patients. And what's good about that is we've done some other research that has shown that when partner anxiety goes down, patient quality of life can go up. So this is an important finding. And then speaking of quality of life, we did see improvements in the physical component score, the SF-36, as well as the mental component score. And again, we saw significant improvements for patients and partners. So the other part was, again, me maybe being insecure with all this and wanting to make sure they really liked it. I had lots of satisfaction surveys, and they basically said, yes, Heather, we like it. So they rated us 4.7 out of 5 was sort of our overall, and they had excellent attendance. And I was at every single one of these groups, and I found the reasons for missing were either a medical appointment, often with their cardiologist. One person was hospitalized, unfortunately, but it wasn't just because they didn't want to be there, which was a wonderful thing. So in this phase 2, we just demonstrated the acceptability and feasibility and potential program effects. But what about cardiovascular outcomes and in comparison to a control group? So we were fortunate to get CIHR funding to do a randomized controlled trial where individuals are, or couples are randomized to either the Healing Hearts Together program or to usual care. And we've now extended many of our measures. So we have still the relationship quality, mental health, and we've expanded some of those mental health measures, as well as quality of life. But we're also looking at a number of physical measures, so things like blood pressure, heart rate variability, cortisol, as well as some inflammatory markers. We're also looking at health behaviors now as well. And we're also linking our data with ICES data to see if there's any changes in major adverse cardiovascular events. I will say that we're about halfway there. We've got about 150 couples that are already in the study. I will say the recruitment really slowed down with COVID, patients not wanting to come on site. And of course, with a number of physical measures, we needed them to be on site. But Kathleen Lalonde, who is a research associate in the lab, wrote a nice paper on how we actually went from this in-person intervention and how to then move that to an online intervention. So we're doing that now, delivering instead of in-person online, and trying to do as much as we can to keep people, and now we're back on site, obviously, so things are rolling again. And then I think in light of a lot of this work that we've been doing with couples, and then of course with the caregiver, I was invited to do a review for current cardiology reports. And of course, I roped in Dr. Karen Bouchard here as a postdoctoral fellow, who is an excellent writer and did a wonderful job summarizing literature, looking at caregivers' distress with coronary artery disease. And what we saw is that there's a real range of distress, as low as 6% up to 67% of partners that are talking about distress. And there's a number of interventions out there for partners. However, a lot more needs to be done. And again, Karen sort of summarized nicely in this paper that one of the ways we might be able to reduce this distress is by helping them with their relationship quality and involving them in things like the Healing Hearts Together intervention. And then finally, sort of on this caregiver piece is, I like to, as you've noticed, the clinical and the research really now, I like to keep it tied together. And so, as you all know, there's many patient guides that the Heart Institute offers, but we don't have a caregiver guide. And so Karen and I, and now Michael, who's a research coordinator, are working on putting together a guide for caregivers. And Karen wrote up a nice paper sort of talking about that process of co-design with not only healthcare providers, but also with patients and with caregivers who are also on this paper. So now I'm going to talk about one final area. And this, of course, has come to me as well through my clinical work, and it's looking at patients with SCAD. So I think we all know that SCAD is more and more becoming recognized as a cause for ACS, and that women are overrepresented, from 80 to 90% of the SCAD population, and younger women, especially up to 40% of them, of MIs, are due to SCAD. There are high rates of recurrence, although there's some more recent literature that's showing that's not quite as high, so that's good news. The etiology of SCAD is still up for discussion. They seldom, however, have traditional risk factors of the other coronary diseases. But one of the things that has come out is precipitating intense stressors, whether that be physical or emotional. But post-SCAD, there's certainly some emotional distress. And to date, we do see things like depression, anxiety, trauma symptoms, and these seem to be quite a bit higher than those with ACS. However, there hasn't been much research looking at that comparison. So there are some limitations, of course, to this research that's out there already. Most studies only look at just depression and anxiety and not some of the others. There's only one that looked at trauma. Samples tend to be fairly small. There's a couple big ones, but most are quite small. As you can see here, one only had 14 patients with SCAD. The other issue is that data collection tends to be done just over time. So the average can be up to 4 years. And so that's when distress has likely already come down, and we're not going to be offering interventions likely at that time point. So really, we need to know what's going on earlier. And as I mentioned, there's a few studies comparing those ACS patients with and without SCAD. On the mental health side as well, interventions are certainly recommended, but there are a few that are provided. There was one study that included 7 patients with SCAD that has been published, and unfortunately it had limited impact. So we really need a comprehensive study assessing the psychological profile and intervention needs of these patients. So another shout out to Karen here, as well as Dr. Catino, for helping us start with this quality initiative here at the Heart Institute to try and figure out what exactly we should be doing for these patients. So the first step was to do interviews with healthcare providers. And so we had a multidisciplinary sort of number of participants from cardiology, nursing, psychology, social work, et cetera. And we asked them, what do you think these patients need? And what they said was, first of all, you really have to acknowledge the uniqueness of SCAD. Second of all, you need to provide intervention programs that include both providers as well as peer support. And then you need to help us as the healthcare providers learn more and have more education about SCAD so that we're better able to care for these patients. And then we said, okay, now we've heard from the healthcare providers, now we want to talk to the patients. So Karen and Kathleen, who I've already spoken about, did a number of interviews. Actually, Karen did all the interviews here at the Heart Institute and asked these patients basically, what do you feel you need? And what came out, first of all, were some of the challenges. So they talked about navigating uncertainty because it was something that the providers were often saying, oh, this is very rare, so we're not really sure what to do. And that was, of course, scary for them. And so they were living with quite a bit of anxiety. They also tried to sort of reconcile their pre and post SCAD identity. Many of these individuals would be talking about how they were very healthy before. They weren't on any medication. They were very fit. They were active. And so it was a real sort of strike on their identity to say, oh my gosh, I now am living with a chronic health condition. They also talked about a sense of isolation. And part of that could be because of their demographic. You know, they're younger women on the most part. And they also talked about managing family dynamics, which, you know, we do hear about with some of the younger patients, but this does seem to come up more with the patients who've had SCAD. And then as far as interventions, they suggested really addressing the unique profile of SCAD in cardiac rehab. You know, some patients would say, you know, I don't fit in with all these sort of white hairs over here in cardiac rehab. And they wanted to be able to do more exercise and felt that the exercise that they were allowed to do was too conservative. They wanted more psychological and peer support. And they wanted more information on SCAD. They were readily aware of all of the knowledge that was coming out, all these publications on SCAD, and they wanted to know, as it was coming, tell us this information. So we finished that QI, and then we said, well, is it really just like this at UHI? You know, we're thinking we're pretty good here, you know, but maybe what's it like across Canada? So we applied to CHR, got some bridge funding to expand to 4 other sites, so total 5 sites across Canada. And Karen and Kathleen completed 90 interviews with obviously 90 patients with SCAD. And they're currently writing up the results. And I'm not going to go into that now, but it is quite interesting. And we do hear quite a bit of what, you know, came out from our patients here, but there are some differences. So then we decided, okay, we need to take what we've learned from this qualitative study and put it into a quantitative study where we get patients to fill out some, you know, validated questionnaires where we can really measure their distress and determine what type of distress they're having and what kind of interventions they would like. So that was our primary question. And then we also want to look at how their distress, if it was different from those that were age and sex matched that did not have SCAD. And also, as I mentioned, with Healing Hearts Together, we're also doing this with SCAD, is looking at the relationship between this distress and MACE over time. We also want to look at social relationship quality and well-being, because a number of the patients did talk about optimism and resilience. And so Karen really enjoys this part. So we said, okay, let's add it in. And so now we're also looking at those variables and how that is linked to MACE as well, and comparing those between ACS patients with and without SCAD. So I don't know if I mentioned this, we did receive CRHR funding to do this second study. And so this is an observational study where we are recruiting 323 ACS patients with SCAD and another 323 without SCAD. And they are completing a number of measures, obviously, on distress, well-being, social relationships, and we also obviously want to hear about their intervention suggestions. So based on some of the things that came out from the interviews, we then put that into a list, and we're asking them to endorse the ones that they really think are important. So, and kudos to Ali, who is the research coordinator. She has recruited about 100 participants into the study to date. I have to say it's somewhat challenging. I'm learning with a multi-site study, but we're moving along. You know, we'll let you know when it's done. But the next piece, and I cannot believe I have to say, I sort of have to thank Twitter for this, because I was forced by Jennifer Reed, Peter Liu, Thais Catino to get on to Twitter. Oh, and not to mention Karen, because she actually made my account before I even did. But anyways, on Twitter, there was all this stuff on SCAD. And so then I, you know, made comments and connected. And so now we're extending this study to the UK, US, and Australia. And we really want to track the trajectory of mental health, distress, and well-being over the year post-SCAD. And so we're just putting that, sort of starting this off, getting ready to write a grant. Help me now. So wish us luck. So I'm coming close to a close here. At this sort of whirlwind tour of psychology and cardiology, and I'm sure you've seen how there's many links, at least the psychology and cardiology a la Heather Tulloch, which is maybe a little bit crazy. But I do want to thank the team here. This is the best part of research, and you know, they keep me on track. They keep me organized, or at least they try. And, you know, every day they make me laugh. So that's really important. And I also want to shout out to Alison Conley, who has become my grant therapist, who calms me, you know, as I'm submitting the grant, who empathizes with me when I think I didn't get it, and then celebrates with me when I actually did. So thank you to everyone. And I'll just finish by saying, you know, we need to treat the heart, but we also need to nurture the mind. Thank you.
Let me do a virtual clap here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Thank you, Heather, for this wonderful overview of your career successes and pathways. I'll remind the team that if you have any questions virtually, you may type them in the Q&A box, but you also may raise your hand, and anybody on site can also raise your hand to get the microphone. And I just wanted to start not with a question, but just with a comment, because this is, of course, an Investigator of the Year lecture. And I think many of us enjoyed hearing this path that you've had. And I think there will be many trainees in the audience that will benefit from this. But I just wanted to say that as a fellow clinician scientist, you really embody the gold standard clinician scientific process, right? So you're well entrenched in your clinical practice as a psychologist. You use that to really draw the pertinent research questions from your practice. You develop these research questions into grants that you're incredibly successful obtaining. You develop these programs, you write the papers, and then you bring that back to the clinic and implement new programs. You really close that loop. And you do this so efficiently. I'm very, very envious. And I just wanted to just put it out for everybody, just to show that this is really the gold standard clinician scientist process. So congratulations, Heather, for all that you do. And I also wanted to say one more thing, because you mentioned that in the very beginning, how you felt, I think that you used the word schizophrenic, or I think you tried to mention that you were being scattered by going at all these different pathways. But what I saw instead was somebody that has a lot of plasticity, and you're able to really tackle many different areas, and you find the teams that complement each step of your research journey to really, get to these answers efficiently and implement them back. So when you see scatter, I see plasticity and teamwork. So once again, congratulations on all your work. I see that there's someone standing in the audience there. So is that because somebody has a question?
Yeah.
I can't tell who that is. So please, can you please
introduce yourself? Yeah, it's Michael. Go ahead.
So my question actually, is it working? Yeah. So my question actually goes with the end of what Dr. Catino was just saying. So throughout undergrad with different researchers and professors and stuff giving advice, I've heard a lot that if you want to go into research, you need to have a pretty defined and focused area of research if you want to get different positions and stuff. And obviously, as you call it, your kind of roller coaster, you've been a bit all over the place, but clearly very successful with it and done really well. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice or tips, for people who have a bunch of different areas of research and they're wanting to go into research, but
at bottom line, you got to do what you enjoy, right? It's kind of like when I talked about exercise right at the beginning. It has to be intrinsically motivating, because research is it's a hard world, right? You get a lot of rejection. So if you're not really passionate about it, then you're not going to survive, bottom line. So I think if you're enjoying it, then just keep doing it. However, I will say that it's a heck of a lot more work to be all over the place, right? Because you're then having to be an expert in so many different areas. And that is definitely challenging, because then, you spend a heck of a lot more time and pulling all those articles, reading all those articles, getting up to the literature, and then doing the work. But if you like to learn, that's great, which we all do. And that's why we do what we do. But, I do think what over time, I sort of learned to try, and I think now I'm doing it more so, where it's really just looking at psychological interventions to improve heart disease, right? And so I won't be jumping all over the place as much now, but I enjoy doing that. It was sort of figuring out what you liked.
Sweet, thank you.
I see there's a comment here from Ross Davies from the chat, congratulating you and your team, Heather, and a question from Dr. Rob Beelans. First of all, congratulating you on your fantastic presentation, and you have done so much to keep us at the cutting edge of research and treatment for our patients' hearts and minds. And then he has a question, recognizing that partners and supports are important, what do you or we can do for patients who don't have these partner supports? Is there any evidence of any specific interventions that can help enable improved cardiovascular outcomes for those patients that don't have a partner support?
Yeah, that's a great question. We focused on partners because about 75% of our patients have spouses when we looked at some of the data here at the Heart Institute. And also they're the ones that tend to be there the most. However, you can do this with family members, of course, right? Or close friends. And in fact, there was another intervention that I was involved in with some of my colleagues, including Paul Greenman at Montfort, where they did a similar intervention to our Healing Hearts Together, but did not make it be the partner. They said you could bring a close friend, you can bring a family member, and to just be able to talk about how did the heart disease affect each other, and to be included in many of the interventions. And that was quite successful and worked well. I think the other thing that we can do is include any sort of family members in some of our interventions. I know, for example, our nutrition workshops, like allow the family members or whoever it is to come if they're going to be supporting that person. So including them in many of the educational opportunities that we have here, I think is one of the ways to go.
I see there's a hand up. I believe is Dr. Ross. Yeah, Dr. Ross Davies has his hand up. Ross, did you want to ask a question or make a comment to Heather? If you do, please unmute yourself. I think you're currently muted.
I'll say hi to Ross. I haven't seen you for ages. Hope you're well.
I just saw him last week when he was honored at our cardiology get together. As Ross maybe sort out his unmuting, I see somebody else is standing at the microphone. Unfortunately, I cannot see who you are. So
Jennifer Reed. Jennifer Reed's at the mic.
Oh, hi Jennifer. I cannot tell if you look very tiny on my screen.
First of all, I just want to thank Heather for an excellent presentation. And I think one point that may not have been stressed enough during this presentation is what an excellent collaborator Heather has been. I have been at the Institute for almost 10 years now. And I can tell you in those 10 years, consistently, Heather is the collaborator that always delivers, whether it's manuscripts, late night phone calls, early morning phone calls, grant reviews. Heather consistently delivers on quality for every collaboration effort that she undergoes. So thank you, Heather.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. My husband didn't always like the phone calls, though.
Yeah, I might be the most.
He's like, "Are you talking to Jennifer again?"
Well, we do have a lot of fun. And so it has been truly a wonderful experience the past decade. My question for you, as you have moved along this course of life and career and research projects, if you had unlimited resources, what do you think the most important area for psychology and mental health, or psychology and cardiovascular health, would be for you to tackle in the next chapter of your career?
Oh my God, why did you do this to me? I don't know. There's so many places. I think the social relationships, and maybe it's just because I talked a lot about it just now, it's in the forefront, but, you know, and maybe that's also coming out of COVID when we've had so much isolation. I really think these social connections are so important for our mental health. So I don't know how I would spend the money, but I would definitely want to do something and do it more in the prevention area, right? Try and prevent, like have these relationships and development so that we don't end up leading to more inflammation or more mental health that then leads to heart disease further. I mean, that's what I would do right now off the top of my head, but I could probably make a list.
I'm sure you could. Thanks, Heather.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Reed's corroborates my initial comment that Heather is the queen of awesomeness at the Heart Institute. So we'll close with that because we are at the top of the hour. So once again, congratulations, Heather, on yet another wonderful achievement for your CV. I really cannot see how you're going to continue to grow these programs and really take the Heart Institute to global leadership in so many of these endeavors that you're pursuing. Congratulations again, and thanks to all for attending.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.